Marijuana, also called weed or pot, is either known as the equivalent of heroin or the wonder drug. Marijuana has gained an increased amount of advocacy towards recreational and medical use, which as a result is now leading to a gradual decriminalization throughout the US and even other parts of the world. But what exactly is marijuana? Marijuana is a psychoactive drug derived from a plant called the cannabis sativa and indica. The sativa plant derivatives are utilized to create an uplifting mood as well as increasing alertness and energy. The derivatives from the indica plant are utilized to relax, have increased appetite, and receive pain relief. There are many other chemical compounds in marijuana such as CBD and THC. The chemical compounds vary in how much they affect people. The major difference between CBD and THC is that THC has the ability to intoxicate, or better known as get high, while CBD does not. CBD tends to provide more of a medical usage as it treats chronic pain, inflammation, migraines, epilepsy, autoimmune diseases, and depression and anxiety. THC is often used recreationally because it has the ability to alter the brain in order to feel high and uplifting. Marijuana has yet to be accepted globally despite being used since ancient times, and throughout many cultures, for example people in ancient China were prescribed marijuana tea to treat malaria, gout, and poor memory. In the US, marijuana was demonized in the 1930s until counterculture in the 1960s began to support the usage of recreational marijuana. In 1996, California was the first state to legalize medical marijuana. Other states followed to legalize marijuana medically and recreationally. Marijuana has been referenced and portrayed through the media, video games, shows, and even music.
All my dreams got dimmer when I stopped smoking pot. Nightmares got more vivid when I stopped smoking pot,
which has a large effect on my youth. Speaking of youngsters, this brings us to my good friend AP, a college student who is an ex-user of marijuana and used it throughout high school.
I started smoking because my friends did. I was a freshman in high school, and my friends on the lacrosse team were discussing it one time at lunch, and I remember vividly we were in a booth and we were talking about weed. One friend had already smoked it. I was really curious, and with my personality, I was desiring to be included. I was seeking inclusion to feel belonging, and so what that created in me was a desire to smoke weed, and my thinking was, oh, if I could smoke weed, then I'll be cooler and I'll be more friends with these dudes. And so the reason why I started smoking weed was because I wanted to fit in. And honestly, I believe that people don't just smoke weed to smoke weed. I think there's always something that leads to smoking weed. You don't get high just to get high. There's always something deeper. And for me, I got high because I didn't know my identity. I had no solid grounding on who I was. I had no solid grounding on the human dignity that I hold as a person. As many of you guys know this, it's really not hard to get weed. I could text someone right now and get a whole bunch of weed. I could probably go down the street and find someone at the gas station and get a whole bunch of weed. Marijuana has become so domesticated that it's everywhere. So I was able to consume it through friends, through superiors, through people I worked with. That's the sad thing now. Pretty much everyone smokes weed now. Everyone does it. And they don't see the long-term harms of it. I smoked a lot of joints, bongs, blunts, pipes. Occasionally I used to eat edibles. I know this is popular at your guys' high school because it was mad popular at mine, which was the dab pens. It was the marijuana oil and the vaporizer. You smoke it and you can get high from wherever. For me, it provided a momentary relief from the thoughts that I was having, but the thoughts would just come back harder. And each time I would medicate to make those feelings go away, I would just create a deeper dependence and a deeper crutch on marijuana. And so I wasn't dealing with my thoughts, I wasn't dealing with my feelings. I was just throwing them out of the way and smoking weed to cover it up like a big Band-Aid. But you can't cover a wound that's severely deep with one Band-Aid. You need something much stronger than marijuana as a drug. And so my mental health was not good. I was severely depressed. I had no hope. I was very hopeless. I was confused. I didn't know who I was. I was seeking my identity through my friends. I was very skinny. I wasn't eating as much. I was losing weight. And I was just overall a sad person. There wasn't many times where I was upbeat and very happy and outgoing and enthusiastic, but rather I was a very sad person. If it wasn't for the Lord, I wouldn't have quit. I had lung problems because I couldn't take a deep breath in, and this is right when I quit smoking marijuana. I stopped, but I still had a little stitch on my right lung, and I couldn't take a deep breath in without having like a block. Regarding memory, I would say, looking back, I do have some memory problems in the slightest, though it's not very like I have Alzheimer's, but again, people don't want to talk about it. When you smoke weed, you're killing brain cells, and that's a fact, and you're literally messing up your memory. There's a portion of your brain that is just killed when you release so much of that cannabinoids, which is the molecular structure of the cannabis, into your brain. I still have some things where I forget stuff, and I don't know if that's because I was boxing, where I competed in a sport where I got hit in the head. Once you're high, you can't go back. In terms of this, once you experience a high, an alternative state of mind, you don't just go back to that sober mindset all the time. So you kind of view it a little differently. You kind of view the world just a tad bit differently, and that's a slight nuance that people might not hold to, but I just think that's how it is for me. There's a lot of health effects that people don't want to talk about. There's a lot of health effects that people don't want to talk about, because what they'll say is marijuana's not as bad as smoking a cigarette, which is technically true because you're not smoking all that tar in your lungs. However, there's other toxins that marijuana has that cigarettes don't have. So my perspective on marijuana is it's bad, and that's strictly from a health side, right? That's not even bringing in the spiritual side of things. It's an escape. A lot of people smoke weed because they don't want to deal with their mental health. I smoked weed because I didn't want to deal with my mental health. In some situations, marijuana is good, and before you get too crazy, listen to what I'm saying. If you are someone who has a chronic illness and who has immeasurable pain, I think marijuana is helpful. I think if you're someone who has a chronic cancer or a chronic arthritis where you can't get out of the bed without taking opioids, and the question is, I'm either gonna take this toxic pill that's gonna definitely make you addicted, or smoke weed. I think smoking weed is better. If you're anxious, and this is where it gets into details where a lot of people are gonna disagree with me. I think if you're anxious and you severely have anxiety and depression to a level where you tried going into therapy and counseling and none of it's working, you've tried doing what they do and none of it's worked, and you have anxiety to a level where you can't even go outside without getting an anxiety attack, I think that's okay. But I think a lot of people lie about their anxiety. I think people just say, I have an anxiety, so I have an excuse to smoke weed. That's what I did. I was like, oh yeah, I have anxiety, I need to smoke weed. Like, no dude, like that's not an excuse.
That was a great perspective from AP. I'm glad he was able to open up and share his experience with marijuana. Next is a skit displaying why some teens have the desire to use marijuana and how they obtain it. I've been going through so much depression and anxiety lately, and I just can't take it, and I don't know any solutions.
Okay. Listen, buddy. I know a guy on Snapchat, between you and me, I know a guy on Snapchat that can help you take the edge off.
Okay, you'll give me their snap?
Yeah, sure, I'll give you the snap. I know the big term's marijuana, but most of the guys, they just call it weed or pot. But yeah, I got a guy for that.
The next interview will be displaying someone who is a school counselor and a psychologist. This person does not have a professional medical or drug therapy background. She only has the ability to speak about experiences associated with marijuana from her profession. She'll be going in depth into why people are dependent on marijuana and how they become a frequent user.
Thinking kind of about the mental effects of marijuana, so it's going to look a little bit different for each person just depending on how it impacts that person. So for some people, they might feel a little more relaxed. For other people, they might feel a little more paranoid. They might feel a little more anxious. They might feel a little more emotional. So it really kind of varies depending on how that person's makeup interacts with the effects of marijuana. So when we're trying to think about why people are so dependent on that, we think about why people are mentally dependent and emotionally dependent on marijuana. I think a big piece of that is just how it impacts them. If it makes somebody feel a lot more alive or a lot more engaged or decreases their feelings of anxiety, they're gonna enjoy that feeling more so than when they're not on it and they're starting to feel more anxious, they're starting to feel more reserved, they don't feel like they can be as relaxed or calm. So I think if people get used to feeling a certain way, if it's beneficial in their eyes with the effects of marijuana, then they're going to become more emotionally dependent on it because they can't feel that way without having that substance in their body. And if they're viewing that as more enjoyable with the substance in their body, that they're going to then, crave that and want to continue feeling that way. Thinking about psychological and mental health treatments in general, we really are kind of thinking about what makes sense for that person, what makes sense for that person's needs, and what their mental health requirements are. So just like different kinds of therapy techniques are really effective for some people and for some mental health needs, they're not always effective for other people. We always encourage people to go and find different therapists, and if you don't feel connected to them, if you feel like your personality doesn't match with theirs, then we encourage you to find somebody else because there are so many moving parts to the effectiveness of therapy, one being the relationship, one being the underlying treatment effects and how that impacts the mental health diagnosis or that impacts that individual person's personality. So if marijuana is used for psychological kind of benefits and treatment plans, then we really want to just make sure that it's effective for the individual who's being treated. If it's not effective or they don't feel like it's achieving the goal that they've set, then they just would want to reevaluate and choose a different treatment. I think people view marijuana in lots of different contexts. I think a lot of it's ever changing right now because each state has different legal requirements and different legal laws. So at a state where marijuana use is legal, they're going to view it more recreationally. There's not going to be as much of a negative stigma towards it because it's something that's accepted, whereas in states where it's not legal yet, or it's just not legal in general, there can be a more negative stigma to it. I think a lot of people's views of marijuana is impacted by their familiarity with it. If someone's around it or has been around it, they're going to be more familiar, so it might not seem as foreign or so untouchable. Whereas if someone's never been around that, they're only been told that it's this negative substance, that it's frowned upon, any kind of negative context, then their view of marijuana is going to be different. So it definitely kind of varies, depending on where you live, depending on your access to it, how, your views of it, and kind of what the people around you, their views are of that.
In a governmental aspect, marijuana has been federally illegal since marijuana was included in the Narcotics Act of 1956, meaning that first-time offenders would receive 2 to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $20,000. Marijuana has been associated with sexual debauchery, violent behavior, and crime. Century, marijuana has a primary negative reputation in the United States. Among other areas, anti-weed legislation in America has been around since the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which heavily restricted the use and sale of marijuana with the requirement of doctor's prescription. Perhaps the most pervasive stereotypes about marijuana pertains to the issue of race. Most people think of weed as a drug used primarily by Black Americans of lower socioeconomic status. The racial stereotypes actually started out as a drug used by Hispanic immigrants, which is how it got the name marijuana. In the early 70s, with Nixon's administration, there were two groups he wanted to target: anti-war protesters and Black people. Nixon himself wove anti-Semitism into the mix. Quote, "Every one of the bastards that are out for legislating marijuana are Jewish," end quote. Thus started the drug war, a fight which is still going on today. This has led to the general targeting of Black communities, especially for things such as drug offenses, including possession. Despite roughly equal usage rates of marijuana between Black and white Americans, Black Americans are much more likely to be arrested for marijuana violations than white Americans. Now we're going to hear a legal case concerning marijuana that involved a white man.
Pot was introduced to me back in the 80s, and that's when it was pretty popular. It was a big culture thing of the whole deal, and a lot of high school kids, and we all smoked weed. Kind of went on from there. After I got a little older and had a job and was doing my thing, I kind of supplemented my income a little bit, on a little weed or a little coke on the side, and just paid for my own recreational use. Got introduced to a situation where I went down to Tucson, Arizona in my early 30s. Had an opportunity to open up a discotheque down there. People who were smoking weed down there, I was asking them how much it cost, and come to find out it was less than half a pay here in Kentucky. And so I came home, and it was just a topic of conversation one day with a close friend of mine, and he brought it to someone that portrayed himself as an insurance agent as a cover, but was basically a large drug dealer. When he found out the amount of money that he could save by getting it from Tucson, Arizona, he asked me if I'd mind connecting him. It got to be a little bit more of a enterprise at that point in time. When I say enterprise, we were selling probably about 2,000 pounds a month. We were having it come up from Arizona. I'd made arrangements with a guy down there that was actually getting it from a tunnel that was tunneled in from Mexico. We were getting the weed from him, and he was sending it up by carrier, or what they call a mule, and periodically I would have to go down and either check the quality or maybe even run a load if somebody couldn't make it. So then in one time, in running one of those loads back from Arizona, I went through St. Louis, Missouri, and I got pulled over on what was called a traffic stop. Traffic stop, the cop asked me if I had marijuana, and I said no, and he said, "Well, we're going to detain you here until we can get a drug dog." My license and everything else was in order, he strictly was detaining me to have this drug dog come over. Yeah, I had about 200 pounds in the trunk of my car, and it was pretty well hidden. We had put coffee around it and some banana leaves and some laundry filters on there, and that kills the dog scent, as we know, and so the dog wouldn't hit. So the officer tapped on the trunk of my car, and when he did so, the dog jumped up on there, and he says, "Oh, he thinks it's in the trunk." Well, lo and behold, of course, hard to hide 200 pounds of pot in the middle of his trunk. And I asked him, I said, why did you pull me over? And he said, because you have Arizona tags. And he says, it's known drug trafficking from north to south is this route, and people from Arizona are primarily where it's coming from. And I said, good to know, note to self. And before I went to court, they were giving me an opportunity to tell where I was getting my source down in Tucson, but doing that was more of a death sentence than it was the other one, which was a couple years in prison. So I said, I'll take 2 years instead of life, because those boys down there, they don't play. And I knew this going in. So I had to go do a couple years in prison. First initial part of that, they kept me in solitary confinement for up to about 9 months and would come by and knock on my door and tell me that if I would roll over, they'd take me out of segregation and possibly even give me early release. But again, that would have been a life sentence. So I elected to just do my time and be done and over with it. Since that period of time, I can't say that I haven't continued to use, because I have. I like smoking weed. It keeps me calm, and I like it better than alcohol because I feel like I'm in more control of myself than I would be if I was drinking. I think it's just a matter of time. It's not a matter of principle or lawfulness, because more than half the states wouldn't be doing it if it was such. And in that being said, I think that's been a good barometer to see just how dangerous or how gateway drug it may be, but I don't see all these other states having these bigger crime issues that are legalizing marijuana. Yes, I must be an advocate. The strains that they've got things coming out, Delta 9 or whatever, that's kind of derivative thereof. I mean, we're already kind of sticking our toe in the water. I mean, we're just calling it something else because it's got a different level of THC. Really? Well, I think the legalization of marijuana across the United States would actually be better for crime prevention as far as that goes, because now there's one less drug that is being smuggled across the border or being sold illegally. I think for taxation purposes, it would help the United States because now it becomes a taxable item like cigarettes is. I think it could give us revenue. As it being illegal, it's filling up our jails, it's filling up our judicial system. In a lot of places it's already legal.
What an interesting story involving the cops and Rob's marijuana. I believe that in some situations, desperate times calls for desperate measures in which people will capitalize whatever way they can in order to survive. Meanwhile, our last interview will be from a guy who smokes marijuana regularly and is an advocate. We will look deep into the history of marijuana and precisely why it has been demonized for so many decades. How do you consume marijuana?
Generally with a pipe, sometimes with a joint, sometimes with a bong, and sometimes with a one-hitter.
What's one hitter?
You carry it in a little box. It's a thin box. It's about 2.5, 3 inches tall, and you can put a little bit that's broken up in there, and it has a little pipe that looks just like a cigarette that you just push some pot in the end of it, so it gives you about 1 hit's worth. It looks like a cigarette, so you can literally just hit it walking down the street. It's just a personal preference, really. Would it be considered medical for just, normal mental health of life? Sure. But do I have any type of diagnosis? No. I choose to smoke it because I enjoy it. It helps me deal with day-to-day life, I guess.
When did you start smoking marijuana?
My first time, I was 17. I would say there was a couple years here and there. I joined the Army, so I didn't do anything then. The only times that I chose to not is if I had a drug test to get a job, and I wouldn't smoke any for a couple months. I'd pass the drug test, and as long as there wasn't any future drug tests, I would smoke whenever I felt like it. I think I have a couple times where we went to Illinois once, and it's just extremely expensive at a legal state marijuana distribution facility. I'd choose not to spend that kind of money for a variant or a name brand of something when I can get what I need and want and enjoy from the guy down the road or what have you. I've got a person that started growing some a few months ago. They're all into, it's this flavor, it's this brand, and I don't even care. California made it legal, right? Other states are making it legal. Think of it like candy. There's not just one Hershey's chocolate bar. There's a Mars bar and a KitKat and a Twix. All your different flavors. It's the same thing with pot. Tutti Frutti, Afghanistan Gold, Kush is a variant strand, and they'll have various flavors. me, those popular brands, they just get me too high. And I don't want to be stoned, still just doing my day-to-day work in life. Rarely do I sit and just get stoned where I don't want to do anything. I get up, I'll have my cup of coffee, have some breakfast, maybe 10 o'clock, maybe I'll hit it once, maybe twice, maybe 2 o'clock, I'll hit it once or twice again. You've got about 15 or so states that are totally legal. It's decriminalized, it's legal, you can smoke it, in the privacy of your own home. You can have it. I think they still have where you can't sell it. It's got to be bought from a reputable distribution. And that's the same thing with alcohol. It would be illegal to buy it from Cousin Joe down the street at his still that he's making at his house. But it's okay to go to the liquor store and buy a bottle of whiskey. If government's going to be involved, they're going to do everything they can to make money off of it and hinder anybody else from making money off of it. So like I said, you've got 15 states that they just say, do what you want, buy it from us. Other states are too scared because of their constituents. They will say, well, you can use it for medical, even though half the people that are going to do it may or may not be doing it for, quote, medical. They just go to a doctor and go, my back hurts. He goes, okay, here's your prescription for weed. I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of legitimacy on that. It's just people that want to not get busted if they get pulled over having weed in their car. They want to say, here's my card, I'm okay with it. And I know a number of people that need some type of medication. They started getting the medical marijuana cards. And I know other people that they're just like, I just like to get high. There's nothing wrong with me, but I don't want to get pulled over and get arrested for something that should be legal everywhere.
What do you think that someone would have in order for a doctor to give a card?
Your major things are like cancer. Marijuana does help with appetite. It helps with anxiety. It helps with sleep disorders. People that have constant pain, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy possibly, Crohn's disease. Marijuana would help because pain subsides a little bit. Your mental focus on it subsides a little bit. So you can actually focus on something besides what's just annoying you in your body and in your physiology. And even positive outlooks on life, really. I would say that there's possible lung concern. Anytime you smoke anything, like I said, I smoked cigarettes for way too long, and I know it's affected my lungs. They're not as healthy as someone who wouldn't have smoked cigarettes. Smoking marijuana, same concept. It's not going to be as bad as cigarettes because you're not going to smoke as much marijuana as you do a cigarette. Marijuana affects everybody in a different way. I'm sure there's many consistencies in how people are affected by it. I know someone that told me that they tried it, didn't affect them at all. They just didn't enjoy it. They're like, I don't understand this at all. When you talk about the negatives of smoking it over time, yes, physiologically, I'm sure it affects your lungs.
Do you think that marijuana is currently in the process of being decriminalized?
Yes. Obviously, it's been over the last 30 years, I guess. There's definitely a shift in decriminalizing it because it hasn't even been illegal for 100 years. It was legal until like the 30s, at least in the US. I don't really know the laws everywhere else. But in the 30s, it was legal. It was common to be prescribed. Reefer Madness is a horrible propaganda movie from the 30s.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity.
Made people that smoke marijuana out to be crazy. They couldn't control themselves, like they were on some type of speed or crack or meth. They equated it with the exact opposite of what it does. And it's propaganda. It's the 1930s. Very few people went to the movies. I don't think anybody had a TV in the 30s. Society was easily manipulated into thinking a certain way. It became a racial thing. In that movie, Reefer Madness, it was something to the effect of, if you're a white woman and you smoke marijuana, you're going to start dating black guys or Mexicans. It was never called marijuana. It was called hemp. George Washington grew hemp, far as I know. I think some states in the 1800s would actually pay their farmers to grow hemp. Once they changed the racial demographics of it, the term marijuana was created to make it like it's a Mexican, Hispanic, Latino drug. And, that's obviously bad for the white people. But I think over the last 30 years, people are getting more common sense to what it does and the benefits. You're going to have lots of people that have no idea what it does. They've never tried it, but they are staunch opinions and fighting against something that they have no knowledge, no real interaction with it. They're vocal and loud, and they keep things from changing for the better. But I think that's improving, and they're eventually going to decriminalize in the U.S. It may take another 30 years before you get states like Georgia, Mississippi, or southern states, because if you look at the map, it's mostly southern states that don't allow it right now in any shape or form.
Why was marijuana demonized in the 30s?
Number one reason, Hearst. He ran a newspaper. I think he ran the Chicago Tribune. He was the biggest newspaper owner in the country. Hemp was taking over as a potential paper creation. This guy Hearst said, I don't think I want that to happen, because since he owned lumber yards and forests and would cut these trees down to build his paper, he didn't want somebody else going, I can grow or make your paper using hemp. It became, I don't want to lose my money and my business and my lumber yard. I'm a newspaper guy. I tell people what to think. He has friends in Congress. They said, what can we do to stop hemp from being available? Anytime that you want to change society, you have to propagandize. Race has been a huge issue in this country since its creation. An easy way to make hemp look bad is to use the race card. That's why they changed it from hemp to marijuana, to make it sound like it's a Mexican thing. No, those dirty Mexicans, they're going to bring rape and drugs and whatever. So it's fear on people's bigotry. This guy Hearst, he could publicize whatever he wanted. It was his newspaper. It took until like the 80s before tacos were normal in the US, because it was a dirty Mexican thing. It's tacos. Everybody loves tacos. But race played a factor in why people wouldn't eat it.
Do you think that the 60s was a time where there's the counterculture that we're advocating for marijuana?
The masses of society didn't look at marijuana as a racial thing anymore. It was just a dirty hippie thing. It allowed the mindset of the people to change. Your hippies in the late 60s, they're having kids in 60s and 70s. That mindset changed, so their kids became me. And I look at it like, well, it can't be that bad. It's just a bunch of free-spirited people that love cool music and go to Woodstock. As we grew, more kids were born in the 80s and 90s. That was a simple mindset. Then we're going, okay, well, wait, it actually works for medicine. Why are we stopping this? If it can help people, why as a society and a government and a country are we not researching this? And it's because the people from the 30s, it was their kids whose mindset was still race and propagandized from the 30s and 40s. It took generations. The first 150 years, hemp was perfectly fine. One major change of propaganda and law takes 100 years to get back to where it was. If the government has to be involved, well, make it legal and make your money off of it. Problem with that is marijuana, anybody can grow it. You can grow it in your house. You can grow it in your backyard. The government can't control it. So they're trying to find a way to meet a middle ground of how does the government make money versus how do we minimize the ability of people to grow it in their houses. And that's never going to happen because it can grow anywhere.
You might be wondering, what do you think about marijuana, Grit? The answer is, I believe marijuana is a substance that can be utilized for medical purposes such as treating chronic pain, stimulating appetite, and helping with sleep disorders. Meanwhile, I do believe marijuana can come with some extreme negative side effects if used long term. The long-term side effects are impaired memory, motor skills, and concentration, along with a chance of developing psychotic disorders. There would be an increased risk of lung diseases if marijuana is frequently inhaled through smoking. All of these possible effects have been concluded by scientific studies across the world. Overall, I believe marijuana has the potential to be beneficial, but comes with a price if used frequently enough, to which one should take into account before using marijuana.
Stay sober.